The fist will run, grasp metal to gun. The spirit sings in classic tones, we gain the battle drum. Our cries will shrill, the air will moan, and crashing to the dawn. The pen won't stay, the demons wing, the hour approaches, burning out the devil's son.
It's June 1974, and news of Rick Wakeman's departure hits the press. In reality, the keyboard wizard had told the band that he was going to leave some 7 months earlier. The band promptly set about searching for a replacement keyboard player. First up was Roxy Music's Eddie Jobson, who declined the offer due to what he perceived as Yes's grandiose and lavish lifestyle. Session musician Jean Roussel, who had played with Alan White previously, was vetoed for criticising them too much. Nick Smith from the Wakeman pet project Wally was also briefly considered, as was another Wakeman associate, Dave Waver from the Strobes, both of whom just didn't feel they were right for the role. Steve Howe claims to have personally contacted Keith Emerson, who also declined.
Chased a million stars and touched as only one can.
The closest real contender was keyboardist Vangelis. John Anderson had been an admirer of him for some time, and the band did practice with him for several weeks. However, it was concluded that his personality was too dominant and flamboyant for this band, and in some ways, the band viewed Vangelis in a similar way to what Eddie Jobson viewed them. Although it may sound cool, I think a Vangelis flavoured relayer may have just come across like an extended topographic side too. Acting on the advice of Yes aficionado and melody maker writer Chris Welsh, the band then approached Patrick Moraz. Like Vangelis, Moraz had worked on film soundtrack work and also with the noodling symphonic prog band Main Horse, a band that Yes had met touring a few years earlier. By 1974, however, Moraz was attracting a lot of attention, playing with the highly acclaimed trio Refugee. Refugee lasted long enough to make one album, and they were literally days away from recording their second when Moraz took up Yes's offer to join them. Apparently Moraz said nothing to his bandmates, and the first they knew about it was turning up at a rehearsal studio to find all of the keyboards missing, the karma of which would return to Moraz later, as we shall see. Moraz was invited to audition with Yes at Chris Squire's house, using the same equipment that Vangelis had left set up. Squire's multi-million-pound mansion house, incidentally, boasts one of the largest thatched roofs in the world. The band played in part of Sound Chaser, something that Moraz has described as the most incredible musical experience of his life, and they asked him to create something around it. He has stated that the entire audition lasted only 2 hours, and he was promptly offered the job the next morning. Astonishingly, this improvised audition was recorded by Eddie Offord, and apparently this is what we hear on the final Relayer record.
The moment spent spread tales of change within the sound. Melting form to rhythm, electric freedom. Move to grounds, our balance stars. wants all to know and see the look in your eyes.
In the development of this album, Anderson was expressly told that this would not be another double, and as a consequence, it's a little bit more direct and focused than Topographic Oceans. That's not saying much. The title, however, was borrowed from side 2 of that album. It must have been a phrase that Anderson liked, and as such, let us advance and retrace the rest of this album's story. Enough is never quite enough with Yes, and with this spirit in mind, and not to be outdone by setting the Hindu Bible to music, Anderson embarked on his next musical ditty, a musical adaptation of the Russian literary epic War and Peace. Anderson's original starting point when writing was the track's ending, the soon section of the track. He then worked backwards and considered what kind of horror the song would have to move to arrive at such a peaceful conclusion. Patrick Moraz has claimed that the title Gates of Delirium was his, and that the inspiration came from a graphic novel called Delirious by artist Philippe Druillet. Our Gates of Delirium begins with two armies facing each other on a field of conflict, both defending their debts of honour respectively. It's as if there was once a peace treaty, an inner pact between them that was now laid to waste. As the soldiers glance up at their flags and batons, they start to consider what the fighting is really all about. Anderson has cited that the end of the Vietnam War was a major influence to this part, and how little is arguably gained as a consequence of war.
In glory, we rise to offer, create our freedom, a word we utter, a word.
As the march into battle quickly begins pace, the interplay between Howe and his bandmates is simply mesmerising. This sequence surely has to be one of the finest that this band has ever recorded. At the time, Anderson was heavily into Turkish electronic composer İlhan Mimologlu. In particular, his piece titled The Wings of the Delirious Demon. There's quite a similarity between this abstract music concrete and what ended up on the final Gates battle sequence. Anderson cites this composer as one of his major influences in the 1975 tour programme, and held a desire for Yes to move more into this type of electronic music at the time. It's believed a much more dramatic and abstract sounding mix of the Gates battle sequence was created, but it was ultimately toned down for the final record. The crashing sounds of fists grasping metal to gun were created by Anderson and Alan White from used car parts from a scrap metal yard that they drove past en route to Squire's Mansion House. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring is also something that Anderson listened to while developing ideas. But interestingly, it was the work of their ex-bandmate Bill Bruford that also had an influence on Relayer. On hearing King Crimson's recently released Starless and Bible Black, Yes decided that they should too adopt a more aggressive edge to their music. The jewel in the album's crown is the mournful prayer for peace that Anderson delivers in the aftermath of the battle. The lines to this song echo the ending of Topographics' Ritual, in that we should all follow the sun into God's light, which is our true reason to be here. Chris Squire has claimed that some of the keyboard parts for this track were first mapped out while Rick Wakeman was still in the band. When one considers that the Soon section was written first, it's probable therefore that it was Wakeman who devised these peaceful waves to help conclude this epic journey. With its sword and sorcery exploits, this track owes a huge debt to the Lord of the Rings novel. When writer J.R. Tolkien died in 1973, there was a huge resurgence in his already popular writing. Roger Dean in fact has credited Lord of the Rings as the inspiration for the Relayer cover, and Tolkien's lines about darkness passing away and the light of a new day being brighter are echoed by Anderson in its soulful conclusion. After such exploits, side 2 of the album is always going to have a tough time to compete. I've always felt that side 2 of Relayer pales in comparison to side 1 in a way that the second side of Close to the Edge is more balanced with its first. Nevertheless, Soundchaser boldly attempts to push the boundaries even further, as Yes put the foot down on the pedal and accelerate their days through jazz fusion inspired electric freedom. The main vocal section to this song was developed by Howard Anderson, but the main riff that gels it all together was Squire's. Apparently he was immensely proud of it and he would play it a lot while warming up to go on stage. Much has been made of the jazz rock fusion of Relayer, with the credit or blame for it generally being attributed to Patrick Moraz. However, it's actually John Anderson who was more vocal about the likes of Mahavishnu Orchestra, a band who this album owes a huge debt to. I think that regardless of Moraz, the general popularity of the fusion genre, added to the backlash that the Meandering Tales took, meant that it was no surprise that their next album had a much faster and frenetic edge to it. Steve Howe has described how the band were ecstatically jumping around in the studio at this time, and you can really feel the power and confidence in the introduction to this track. Sadly, this momentum is cut to an abrupt halt about 3 minutes in, when the track shifts tone completely with some ponderous flamenco style playing on Steve Howe's Fender Telecaster. With this section gladly out of his system, the band returned to the original theme, but now with an extra ballet and monkey chant thrown in for good measure. Soundchaser is a breathtaking track in a style that I personally wish that the band had explored more. However, I can understand for some that the next Karma track just can't come soon enough. This beautiful and melodic conclusion was dreamed up by Steve Howe while boating on the Serpentine Lake in London's Hyde Park. The initial tone of the song glides along effortlessly, like a warm summer's afternoon. The lyrics begin simply and then transcend into something much more spiritual, with allusions to surrendering one's soul and abandoning fear. The opening section, incidentally, was originally written by Howe back in the late 1960s. The middle section of the track is dominated by Howe's slightly out-of-place guitar, as if his sailboat suddenly catches hold of a Hawaiian wave into the cosmos. The song sails away to a seemingly esoteric Eastern chant by Anderson, which really just consists of his made-up meaningless words. In terms of tracks that could have but didn't make it onto Relaya, Anderson has referenced two songs that could have made it onto the album. One he tantalisingly describes as being too intricate to play, and the other one must certainly have been Turn of the Century.
Did I smile at the turn of the century? Tell me plainly.
Early recordings of Turn of the Century exist in a more electric and weightier Relaya-like style than how it ended up on Going for the One. However, what's interesting to note that this early version features a section of Squire's Fish Out of Water track silently falling within it, and also faint elements of Howe's Lost Symphony, thus proving that this recording predates the release of Yes's solo albums. Therefore, it probably was a contender for Relaya at some point. The album was another commercial success for the band, charting in the top 5 in both the UK and the US. The band promptly embarked on a US tour over November and December of that year, before picking up again in the UK in April, and then returning to the US and Canada over June and July. The tour setlist features all of the Relaya and Close to the Edge albums, with Ritual from Topographic and a few earlier tracks. Not to be upstaged by the band's incredible array of silk kimonos, Roger Dean and his brother Martin set a new benchmark in stage design and lighting with otherworldly fiberglass creatures. None more so than the huge three-headed Hydra snake that they used on the 76 leg of the tour. Due to limitations with some concert venues, not all of the audiences got to see the sheer scale of this set, but when they did, it was spectacular. Yes were one of the first bands to use laser lights in their shows, which beamed out during the drumming climax to Ritual and Delirium's Soon. Chris Squire has described how the band spent a fortune on filming a professional concert video for the 1976 tour, but then, and agonisingly to us, they lost the tape. In the middle of these two tours, as a means to recharge their creative batteries, Anderson hatched the idea of each member creating a solo album. Whilst no one album consistently matches the heights of the previous Yes albums, each is a worthy addition to the Yes catalogue. First out of the traps was Steve Howe with his album Beginnings. It's a strange album, which people are generally quite critical of. It feels a little bit like Howe has been let off the leash and simply throws too many ideas onto the record than what it should really have. Many critics have also questioned Howe's decision to sing on the record himself, but personally I feel it somehow works and it gives the album a quirky, hippie naivety which I enjoy. Howe's original plan was to invite the singer from his pre-Yes band Bodcast to sing on the album, but a last minute change to the recording dates meant that Howe had no option but to sing himself, or so he claims. Squire's Fish Out of Water is probably the most accessible of all the albums, with the opening track Hold Out Your Hand arguably being the best moment on all the solo albums. Played live by the band in 1976, it could have perfectly sat on Going for the One had Parallels not been used. Parallels, incidentally, was originally written though for this album. The well-placed flourishes of saxophone and flute and strings create a mellow vibe on this record, yet it can still pack a punch when it wants to. Some of the tracks have a tendency to meander a little, but on the whole, there really isn't a bad moment on it.
All you got to do is hold out your hand.
It has a contemporary West Coast feel to it, with Squire consciously trying to make something that sounded like his own musical love, Crosby, Stills and Nash. The unsung hero of this album is classical composer and Squire's childhood friend, Andrew Bryce Jackman, who co-wrote much of the album but declined the credit offered to him by Chris. The title is of course a reference to Squire's nickname The Fish, and the cover shows him stood behind the elevator doors of a now demolished hotel in Detroit. I would have loved to have found an image of these doors, but the best I can do is show the same herringbone style metalwork. The next album released was by Patrick Moraz with The Story of I. As with Steve Howe's Beginnings, Moraz throws everything and the kitchen sink at the listener, with no regard for either their ears or their sanity. In saying this, however, we certainly get more than our money's worth on this album. However, I'm not sure this could be said for the record company. With recording being spread across Europe and South America, this album must have cost a fortune to make. Apparently whilst on tour, both Moraz and John Anderson spotted a strange looking tower building, and Anderson encouraged his bandmates to base an album concept around this. Moraz provides an elaborate explanation of the concept on the record sleeve in his own handwriting. In this fun and wholly original album, Moraz takes us on a wild and rhythmic journey that's not that dissimilar to the latter cha-cha parts of Soundchaser. It's not an album though I imagine people play a lot, but it's certainly one that you will not forget. Considering his often uncredited Yes writing, it's surprising that Alan White didn't have a hand in the composing of any of the songs on his solo offering. Ramshackled is essentially a reunion album by White's old band called Happy Magazine, and it echoes a lot of the soulful jazz rock grooves that were popular in the mid-70s. There's one notable and standout exception to this, and that is the track Song of Innocence. With contributions from Anderson and Howe, this track could have easily been incorporated into Going for the One, and is not that dissimilar to Turn of the Century or Wonder Stories.
Sound of flute, now it's mute. Birds delight day and night. Nightingale
The track was performed live by Yes on some 1976 shows.
in the sky.
The album is an enjoyable listen, but it's one that I don't imagine many Yes fans will return to that often. Either intentionally to make a point, or perhaps due to the sheer length of time he spent on it, John Anderson certainly saves the best solo album to the last. Elias of Sunhillow tells the story of a group of otherworldly travellers, the same ones that were on the flying sailboat that traversed the covers of Fragile and Yes songs. It's thought that the album was developed by Anderson during the time he spent with Vangelis, just prior to the Relaya sessions. And Vangelis' 1975 Heaven and Hell album does sound very similar in parts. Anderson has denied that Vangelis played the keyboards on this album, after concerns were raised by Vangelis' management. Listeners' opinion, however, is divided on the matter. Anderson said that he spent 10 hours a day for 3 solid months recording this album, with only himself and engineer Mike Dunn being allowed to hear the material prior to its release. The absence of his other bandmates allows Anderson to breathe fresh air and light into this record, and it creates a wonderful, peaceful mood for the listener. It's an astonishing feat of engineering, with Anderson apparently playing all of the instruments himself. Tolkien-esque artwork is not that of Roger Dean, who was apparently too busy to commit to the project. It's by a Liverpool artist called David Fairbrother Rowe. Rowe had previously created album cover, book and concert promotion designs. He was a fan of Yes and progressive rock in general, and is said to have felt a great connection with this cover. He got to know Anderson well, and he's the guy that stood on the far left of the inner cover photo. With Anderson and Rowe both staking claims to designing the cover's geometric symbol, one can only assume that they collaborated on it together. Variations on this shape can be found across numerous spiritual and religious groups, most notably the Golden Rosy Cross. There are numerous interpretations as to the symbol's meaning, with Anderson's being that the square represents the 4 ancient tribes to which all people are believed to come from. The triangle is the interconnection of our mind, body and soul, or the Holy Trinity, whilst the circle represents the heavens that bind us all together. With the solo albums out of the system, the band then focused on their next album. In an upbeat interview from late 75, Howe talks with great enthusiasm about the newfound energy in the band and how they were improvising and jamming together in ways that they simply hadn't done before. Knowing that improvisation was something that Mraz excelled in, this suggests that he had a big influence in the involvement and the construction of songs around this point, songs that would appear later on Going for the One. And this, and brace yourselves Wakeman fans, includes the song Awaken. Early versions of Awaken were played on the latter shows that summer, and it really did have a kind of summer feel to it, with more sway and groove than the later epic that it would turn into. Mraz has claimed in interviews that he wrote all of the Awaken track, and Steve Howe stated that Mraz should have indeed been given a writing credit on it. On his second solo album, Mraz includes a track called Time for Change, which shows us how his version of the track could have sounded like. There's a plausible belief that the Going for the One demos that appeared on later CD reissues had Mraz mixed out of them, and this could be to downplay his involvement, or perhaps these could be the tracks that Wakeman was played to encourage him back into the fold of the band. The final weeks of Patrick's involvement with the band are mysterious. In November 1976, Yes relocated to Mraz's home country of Switzerland to record the Going for the One album. To put the band's faith in Mraz in context, he received a hugely expensive custom-built Oberheim synthesizer at this time. It was shipped out to the Mountain Studios in Switzerland to record the Going for the One tracks on. I find it hard to believe that the band would go to this much expense if it wasn't their intention to record this album with Patrick. In later years, the Yes members, and especially Anderson, have been somewhat elusive when discussing Mraz's departure. A picture is often painted of Mraz being too eccentric or too hard to pin down to play specific things. Alternatively, stories of his Swiss accent making him too hard to understand have been banded around. I'm not sure how much of this is true. Firstly, Mraz's spoken English is as eloquent as anyone. In addition to being a phenomenal musician, he comes across like an intelligent and cultured man, and a speaker of many different languages. Patrick's work ethic has also been used as an excuse, but this just doesn't marry up with his huge involvement with the Yes solo projects. Sadly, the decision to replace him with Wakeman seems to be based more around finances as opposed to any actual musical differences. Apparently all concerned, and Wakeman in particular, were accruing huge debts at this time, and manager Brian Lane, who also managed Wakeman, engineered his return to the fold to bolster the band and Wakeman's bank accounts. Mraz has stated that he was aware of rumours of his exit before it happened. This must have been incredibly saddening for him, and he's later cited the enormous stress and later depression that this caused him. He's also claimed that he was paid nothing for his contributions to the Yes 1976 tour, one that played to huge crowds, with some of over 100,000 people. He also says at one point he, his wife and baby daughter were effectively left homeless and penniless on the streets after being told to leave the band. Time, however, is a healer, and Mraz now looks back fondly and proudly of his time spent with Yes. He's regularly seen at fan conventions and online interviews and tribute band concerts. Mraz's 2.5 years with Yes have earned him not only a respected place in the band's history, but also a special place in the hearts of all its fans.
Bagpuss gave a big yawn and settled down to sleep. And of course, when Bagpuss goes to sleep, all his friends go to sleep too. The mice were ornaments on the mouse organ. Gabriel and Madeleine were just dolls. And Professor Yaffle was a carved wooden bookend in the shape of a woodpecker. Even Bagpuss himself, once he was asleep, was just an old, saggy cloth cat. Baggy and a bit loose at the seams. But Emily loved him.